The torches burned low inside the timber hall, their smoke curling toward the rafters as silence settled over the gathered warriors. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but inside, no one spoke. At the center of the room knelt a defeated enemy, bound, breathing, waiting. The men standing around him were not shouting in triumph. They were watching. Waiting for something older than revenge. Stories would later whisper of what happened next. Of a ritual so brutal that even hardened chroniclers struggled to describe it without horror. A punishment not meant only to kill, but to send a message, to enemies, to rival kings, and perhaps even to the gods. It would be called the Blood Eagle. Some would insist it was real. Others would argue it was myth, exaggerated by fearful monks and poetic saga writers centuries later. But the legend endured. In a world where reputation was survival and fear was a weapon sharper than steel, such a ritual, whether fully carried out or carefully staged, could shape the fate of kingdoms. The question is not only whether it happened, but why the story refused to die. Because in the Viking Age, terror was sometimes more powerful than the sword itself. To understand how such a dark tradition could emerge, you have to step into the world of the Viking warrior. Between the late 8th and early 11th centuries, Scandinavia was not a unified kingdom but a fractured landscape of competing jarls and petty kings. Power was personal. Authority rested not in written law alone, but in reputation, loyalty, and strength. A leader who appeared weak did not remain a leader for long. In this world, honor was currency, and vengeance was often expected. The Viking Age is often marked by the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, when Norse warriors struck a monastery off the coast of Northumbria. To the Christian world, it felt like divine punishment. To the Scandinavians, it was opportunity. Raids brought silver, slaves, and status. But beneath the violence was a structured society. At the top stood the jarls, wealthy nobles who commanded ships and warriors. Below them were the carls, free farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of society. At the bottom were thralls, enslaved individuals captured in war or born into bondage. Religion shaped everything. The Norse believed in gods who valued courage and sacrifice. Odin, the All-Father, was not simply a god of wisdom but also of war and death. Warriors hoped to reach Valhalla, the great hall where fallen fighters feasted until Ragnarok. Dying bravely in battle was not tragedy, it was honor. This belief system did not eliminate fear, but it reframed it. Pain, endurance, and even ritualized violence could carry sacred meaning. Storytelling reinforced these values. Skalds recited sagas in smoky halls, praising heroic deeds and merciless vengeance alike. A man's legacy depended on how his actions were remembered. In such a culture, brutality was not always random cruelty. It could be symbolic. It could be performative. It could be calculated to echo far beyond the moment itself. And in a society where enemies watched for weakness, the line between justice, revenge, and ritual could become dangerously thin. The ritual most often associated with this dark reputation is known as the Blood Eagle, a name that has echoed through centuries of legend and debate. According to later Icelandic sagas written in the 13th century, the ritual involved carving the shape of an eagle into the back of a defeated enemy and pulling the ribs outward to resemble wings. Whether described literally or symbolically, the image was unforgettable. It appears in sources such as the Orkneyinga saga and accounts connected to the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. One of the most famous references concerns King Aella of Northumbria, who ruled in the mid-9th century and was defeated after the arrival of the great heathen army in 865. According to tradition, Aella was captured following the fall of York in 866 and executed in this manner as revenge for the earlier death of Ragnar. But there is a complication. The sagas describing this event were written centuries after the actual campaigns in England. They were composed in Christian Iceland, drawing from oral traditions that had evolved over generations. This raises an important question: were these accounts recording a real ritual, or amplifying violence for dramatic effect? Medieval writers often used vivid imagery to symbolize power and vengeance. The term, cutting an eagle, may have originally been poetic language for killing an enemy and dedicating the act to Odin, whose animal symbols included ravens and eagles. Over time, metaphor may have hardened into literal description. Yet the persistence of the story is striking. Even if exaggerated, it reflects how Vikings wanted to be remembered, or how their enemies feared them. The execution of a captured king would have carried enormous symbolic weight. In a world defined by honor and retribution, punishing a rival ruler publicly sent a message across borders. Whether the blood eagle was physically performed exactly as described remains debated among historians. Some argue it was anatomically possible, though extraordinarily brutal. Others believe it was saga embellishment. What matters is that the legend endured. It became part of the Viking identity in both medieval memory and modern imagination. And in a time when reputation could determine survival, the power of such a story may have been as influential as the act itself. In the 9th century, violence was rarely random. It was deliberate, strategic, and often symbolic. When the great heathen army landed in England in 865, its leaders were not merely raiders seeking silver. Figures such as Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson commanded coordinated forces capable of capturing cities and dismantling kingdoms. Their seizure of York in 866 demonstrated discipline and long-term planning. Public displays of punishment, especially against kings or high-ranking nobles, were not acts of uncontrolled rage. They were statements. In a fractured political landscape, a dramatic execution could echo louder than any victory in open battle. If King Aella of Northumbria was indeed subjected to the blood eagle after his defeat, the act would have carried powerful meaning. Aella had reportedly played a role in the death of Ragnar Lothbrok, and revenge in Norse culture was not optional, it was expected. Avenging a slain father or brother restored honor and reinforced legitimacy. But beyond personal vengeance, such an execution would serve as psychological warfare. Word would travel quickly through monasteries, courts, and trade routes. Rival rulers would hear not only that the Vikings had won, but that resistance came with terrifying consequences. Fear was a weapon that required no supply chain. It weakened enemies before armies even met. Anglo-Saxon chronicles often described Viking cruelty in stark, almost apocalyptic language. Whether exaggerated or not, these accounts reveal how deeply their tactics unsettled Christian Europe. Rulers sometimes paid Danegeld, tribute in silver, simply to avoid destruction. The reputation of brutality reduced the need for constant fighting. In that sense, terror could be economically efficient. Medieval Europe was not unfamiliar with harsh punishments. Execution methods across kingdoms were often public and severe. What made the Viking tradition distinct was its blending of ritual, revenge, and spectacle. Violence could be theatrical. It could invoke gods, honor, and memory all at once. The possibility of something like the blood eagle, even if rare, fit into a broader strategy of dominance through reputation. Whether fully real or partly symbolic, the story amplified Viking power. And in a world where perception shaped alliances and rebellion alike, that power could shift the balance of entire kingdoms. Modern historians and archaeologists have approached the legend of the blood eagle with caution, balancing fascination with skepticism. Unlike the sagas, which were written centuries after the events they describe, physical evidence must speak through bone, soil, and silence. Excavations across England and Scandinavia have uncovered mass graves, weapon injuries, and signs of violent conflict from the Viking Age. Yet none have provided clear, indisputable proof of the specific ritual described in later texts. There are skeletons showing cut marks, broken ribs, and signs of execution, but these injuries alone cannot confirm the dramatic procedure recorded in saga literature. Forensic specialists have debated whether such a ritual was even anatomically possible. Some researchers argue that separating the ribs from the spine in the manner described would have required significant precision and strength. And that survival during the process would have been brief. Others suggest that medieval descriptions may have exaggerated or misunderstood the physical reality of violent execution. It is also possible that the ritual, if it occurred, was performed only in rare, highly symbolic cases rather than as a common practice. Complicating the question further is the role of Christian chroniclers. Many written accounts of Viking violence come from monasteries that suffered during raids. These writers viewed Norse warriors as pagan enemies, sometimes framing their actions in apocalyptic or moralistic language. Descriptions of brutality could serve theological purposes, portraying the invaders as instruments of divine punishment or embodiments of chaos. Over time, such narratives may have amplified particular stories to emphasize the savagery of those who threatened Christian lands. Yet the absence of clear archaeological proof does not automatically dismiss the possibility. Many medieval rituals and punishments left limited physical traces, especially when bodies were burned, buried in shallow graves, or left exposed. What remains certain is that the blood eagle legend sits at the intersection of myth and history. It forces modern scholars to weigh poetic tradition against physical evidence, and to confront how memory shapes our understanding of the past. Whether literal or metaphorical, the story reveals as much about medieval storytelling as it does about Viking warfare. To understand why a ritual like the blood eagle could even be imagined, it is necessary to look at the spiritual framework of Norse belief. Viking religion was not centralized or governed by a single sacred text. It was woven into daily life, into oaths sworn over drinking horns, into sacrifices made at seasonal gatherings, and into the stories recited beside hearth fires. The gods were not distant moral judges. They were powerful, complex beings who valued strength, cunning, and sacrifice. Among them, Odin held a unique and unsettling place. Odin was associated with wisdom, war, poetry, and death. He was said to have sacrificed himself upon the world tree, Yggdrasil, to gain knowledge of the runes. This act of self-inflicted suffering elevated pain into something meaningful, even sacred. Warriors believed that those who died bravely might be chosen by Odin's Valkyries and carried to Valhalla, where they would feast and prepare for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world. In such a belief system, death in combat was not simply loss. It was transition. Ritual sacrifice was also recorded in places like Uppsala in Sweden, where chroniclers described offerings made to secure divine favor. Animals, and sometimes humans, were said to be dedicated to the gods during times of crisis. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, they indicate that ritualized violence had spiritual significance in Norse culture. The eagle itself carried symbolic weight. In Norse mythology, eagles were associated with both battlefields and divine observation, creatures that circled above war and death. If the blood eagle ever occurred, it may have been intended not only as punishment but as a symbolic offering, a gesture that merged vengeance with religious devotion. Alternatively, the poetic image of cutting an eagle may have been a metaphor rooted in this mythological symbolism. Either way, the story reflects a worldview in which violence, honor, and faith were deeply intertwined. The gods were watching, and actions on earth were believed to echo beyond the mortal realm. In that context, even the darkest traditions could carry meaning far greater than their physical act. Long before modern media shaped their image, the Vikings understood the power of reputation. Stories traveled faster than ships. A single raid, described in terrified detail by survivors, could weaken a region more effectively than months of campaigning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other monastic writings often portrayed Norse warriors as merciless invaders who burned churches, slaughtered innocents, and desecrated sacred spaces. Whether entirely accurate or heightened by fear, these accounts shaped how Europe perceived them. Fear became part of their identity. In many cases, that fear translated directly into political advantage. English rulers and Frankish kings sometimes paid Danegeld, tribute in silver, to prevent destruction. This was not charity, it was strategy. Paying tribute acknowledged the Vikings' ability to inflict damage and their willingness to do so. The mere threat of violence became profitable. When stories of extreme punishments like the blood eagle circulated, they amplified this psychological pressure. An enemy who believed capture meant a horrifying death might flee or surrender rather than resist. Saga culture reinforced this reputation internally as well. Skalds celebrated bold acts of vengeance and courage, embedding them into collective memory. Over time, these stories blurred the line between history and legend. A dramatic execution might be retold with added detail, each generation heightening its intensity. The goal was not only accuracy. It was impact. A leader remembered as ruthless commanded loyalty and fear long after his death. Psychological warfare did not require constant bloodshed. It required narrative. If rival kingdoms believed that the Vikings practiced rituals beyond the norms of Christian Europe, that belief alone could shift alliances and strategies. In a medieval world where communication was slow and rumor filled the gaps, perception could determine survival. The enduring legend of the Blood Eagle fits within this larger pattern. Whether fully real, partly symbolic, or heavily exaggerated, the story contributed to a reputation that shaped diplomatic decisions and battlefield morale. It reminds us that power in the Viking Age was not measured solely by swords and ships. It was measured by how deeply your enemies feared what might happen if they fell into your hands. In the end, the truth behind the Blood Eagle may never be fully settled. The sagas describe it with chilling detail, yet archaeology offers no clear confirmation. Historians continue to debate whether it was a literal ritual, a poetic metaphor, or a story shaped by fear and propaganda. But perhaps the more important question is not whether every detail occurred exactly as written, but why the legend endured for so long. The Viking Age was defined by ambition, expansion, and the constant struggle for honor. In such a world, reputation was a weapon. A story powerful enough to terrify kings and monks alike could influence alliances, tribute, and resistance. Whether performed in rare cases or amplified through centuries of storytelling, the idea of the Blood Eagle became part of the Viking legacy. Today, modern films and television often revive the image, blending fact and fiction into dramatic spectacle. Yet beneath the myth lies a deeper reality: the Vikings understood that fear could conquer where swords could not. And sometimes, the darkest traditions are remembered not because they were common, but because they were unforgettable.